Hi guys, hope you're keeping well. Now today we're moving on to our penultimate poet, so that is the American poet Adrienne Rich, and we're doing 4 poems by Rich, so you should have the notes at this stage. Remember, it's a good idea to have a look at the notes first and then read through the poem and then have a look at this particular video. So Adrienne Rich then, we're looking at the first poem, Aunt Jennifer's Tigers. Okay. So when we look at the poem itself just on the page, without even reading a word, we can see, of course, that it is quite regimented, it's very well structured. It consists of 3 quatrains. And we notice, of course, a regular rhyming scheme as well. So we can see in the first verse, screen, green, tree, uncertainty. So that's A, B, B. Second verse then, wool, pull, band, hand, so CD, CD, so the end line rhyme, the true rhyme. And finally then, of course, we have lie, by, made, and unafraid. So of course that would be EF, EF. Okay, so what she's trying to do here, of course, is she's trying to suggest then something that is very strict, very regimented, something that's very tightly controlled. So obviously the theme then, of course, works in tandem with the style that she has adopted. Okay, so that gives us an idea then, perhaps we'd say, of what her style, her early style was like. Because remember, she was born in 1929 and her first collection of poems, first anthology then, was published in 1951. Okay, so she was writing when she was a child and a teenager, and then writing through college, Radcliffe College, of course, which is Harvard. And then she was encouraged by her father. Remember, her father was a doctor, a pathology professor, so he encouraged her to write. So at the very beginning of her poetic career as such, then, she adopted this kind of masculine style of writing. And then we can see how it evolves and changes then throughout the remainder of her career. So the title itself, Aunt Jennifer's Tigers. Now, Aunt Jennifer is not a real woman. Okay, she becomes like a character essentially in this particular poem. And she comes to represent a sort of every woman or an every married woman. And remember, of course, that Rich is writing about society in the 1950s. She's writing about women's lives in the 1950s. She's writing about identity. And she's writing really about the individual versus society, which reminds us a little bit of Emily Dickinson. So Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, of course, they're not real. Basically what they are, they would be part of the panel that she is stitching or embroidering. It's a tapestry. So basically she creates a fire screen and then the embroidery is placed on that particular screen. So it's purely decorative. So it's something that's very imaginative, creative, artistic. But if you think about it, what she's trying to say here, she's trying to say that the ordinary woman at home is capable of producing art. But this sort of art is just simply dismissed as just sort of arts and crafts. It's not taken seriously. So she's emphasizing, perhaps we'd say then, the idea that women's artistic endeavors are trivialized or minimized, and that women artists or female artists then, of course, are marginalized as such when it comes to society, and especially when we think back to the 1950s. And that would remind us, perhaps we'd say, of Adrienne Rich's own mother, Helen, who before she was married was a very talented pianist and composer. But she gave all of that up then when she got married and she had 2 children. So it's the idea of sort of like women sacrificing then their ambitions and dreams. And here we have this very nondescript, very ordinary woman, Aunt Jennifer, who sits in her chair stitching and embroidering or weaving together this particular tapestry, and it goes unnoticed. It just becomes part of the panel on a fire screen. Nobody really sees it, nobody really pays any attention to it, and it's kind of all this artistic endeavour, all of these ambitions and dreams, they just simply, of course, die with her. Okay, so that's what's suggested then by the title. Also in the title, of course, we get the idea of a contrast here. We have Aunt Jennifer, who's very meek and mild. She's quite passive. She's very quiet. She is essentially depicted as powerless throughout the poem. Then we have the image of the tiger. And if you think about it, a tiger would obviously represent the idea of freedom, something quite exotic, the idea of adventure, the idea perhaps of ferocity and strength and power. So we have the powerful tigers and we have the powerless Aunt Jennifer. So the structure, the use of contrast, essentially, is immediately apparent here. So there we have our kind of first and maybe second, we'd say, aspects of style or techniques or poetic devices that we can focus on here. So the contrast is very strong throughout the poem. At the beginning, it's implied, and then by the third verse, then it becomes very obvious, sort of explicit as such then. Okay, just in terms of style then, I'll just pinpoint a few simple aspects. So obviously we have the structure, we have the use of contrast, then we have the use of colour, so strong visual images. Okay, we have topaz, the gold colour, we have green, we have white. Okay, so natural colours are used in the poem and they become very potent symbols. We have, of course, the symbolism of Aunt Jennifer herself and then the tigers, and then we have references, of course, the ivory needle and so on too, and we can see what they would represent. We can look then at the sound effects that she uses, so alliteration and assonance, those would be the dominant ones. We can have a look perhaps at a few simple examples of consonants, or maybe we could look at euphony versus cacophony in the poem as well, so soft sounding language, remember, versus harsh sounding language. Okay, so remember, of course, that we're looking at her early style, her juvenilia. And later on then, when we're looking at the second, the third and the fourth poems, we can focus on how different they are and how her style then is changing and evolving over time. Okay, so think about a very simple scenario here. So we have Aunt Jennifer, who is at home, sitting in a chair and creating this particular tapestry then. Okay, so think about it like a mesh, and then think about using obviously wool or a thick thread then to create a particular design, a particular image. And here it's quite specifically, of course, the tigers in their natural habitat then, the jungle. So Aunt Jennifer's tigers prance across a screen. So think about the word prance here. It might suggest to strut or to stride, to bound or to bounce here. So we have a great sense of the tiger's energy and power and strength. It's almost like a coiled strength here as such. And think about it, it's quite ironic, of course, that they're described as Aunt Jennifer's tigers, because they're seen as very independent, kind of individual creatures here as such. But she, after all, is the artist and she's creating them. She's weaving this particular picture as such. So it's quite ironic then that they're described as Aunt Jennifer's tigers. But this is a way of expressing herself. It's a way perhaps of expressing her identity and her sort of latent or hidden power, or the fact that she wasn't able to express herself openly in any way back in the 1950s. So the verb prance then is chosen very deliberately to emphasize then, of course, the tigers, because the tigers are depicted as super confident, even arrogant, quite haughty perhaps as well. Okay, so they kind of stalk across the landscape. So Aunt Jennifer's tigers prance across a screen. The screen, obviously, of course, would be the fire screen that I mentioned already. Bright topaz denizens in a world of green. So a denizen just very simply is an inhabitant. Okay, so someone who lives in a particular place. But think of bright topaz. The topaz is a precious gem, precious stone. So topaz would be a yellow or a gold. So if you kind of think about it, something that's precious and rich and very vibrant is emphasized here. The world of green then, of course, would suggest a perfect, lush landscape. Think of a kind of I suppose something tropical, essentially something exotic again. So if we think of gold and green, of course, they're natural colours, but they're very vivid colours as well. And it's kind of emphasizing something that is very rich and very extravagant. So she's trying to emphasize the beauty, of course, of the natural world here. And if we think about it, of course, the tigers have their freedom to roam, essentially. They're very familiar with this particular environment. They're not cowed by it. They're out there and they're free. So once more, of course, the contrast then is between the tigers in their natural environment or habitat, and then Aunt Jennifer, of course, who has married a man who seems to be, or at least is depicted as quite dictatorial, quite controlling. There's even a hint of his cruelty in the second stanza and moving into the third stanza as well. So they are bright topaz denizens of a world of green. They do not fear the men beneath the tree. So you're going to have to ask yourself, okay, why are the men beneath the tree here? And it's kind of the idea that these men are sort of intruding on the tiger's natural environment or habitat. Are they hunters? But there's no mention of guns. Are the men just simply, of course, looking for shade? It does suggest if they're beneath the tree that maybe they're sheltering, they're trying to protect themselves, maybe they're wary of the tigers. So it's really emphasizing once more how the tigers dominate this particular environment, that they're very much in control, that they're masters of all they survey. And in a way then, of course, Aunt Jennifer is projecting her wish for herself onto the tigers and then investing that in her work of art. So they do not fear the men beneath the tree, they pace in sleek chivalric certainty. So even think of the word pace there, of course, that would suggest once more their strength, their control, and the idea of the freedom of their movement is reinforced in pace as well. It might suggest, of course, this is a hint or a threat of danger. They could pounce at any moment, of course, that they can inflict quite a lot of terror, or they can inflict, of course, quite a lot of harm on the men beneath the tree. So they pace in sleek chivalric certainty. So think of how chivalry is used as an adjective here. It's turned into chivalric. So that would suggest the idea, of course, of a knight or a gentleman. There's something quite dignified and noble about these particular creatures, these tigers. And perhaps it would suggest the idea of strength and power if we think the notion, of course, of a knight at arms. So sleek, of course, would suggest that kind of supple movement, but it might suggest, of course, literally just their glossy fur as well. So they're in peak condition. They're in their prime, essentially, rather like a young knight then, of course, who goes out seeking adventure. Certainty, of course, would reinforce the idea of how proud they are, and she deliberately uses that word proud towards the end of the poem in the last line as well. So certainty, of course, would suggest how fearless, how sure they are of themselves. Once more, they're kind of imperious, they're sort of haughty, essentially. So she's reinforcing then a lot of the positive sort of images and ideas associated with the tiger. Okay, or tigers as such then in the opening stanza. Okay, even think of the sound effects here as well. Aunt Jennifer's tigers prance across a screen, bright topaz denizens, a world of green. They do not fear the men beneath the tree, they pace in sleek chivalric certainty. So towards the end, of course, we do get that soft sibilant sound here. It's not sinister, it's just more sort of measured, it's very calm, it's very composed, rather like the tigers themselves. Okay, moving into the second verse then. Aunt Jennifer's fingers fluttering through her wool find even the ivory needle hard to pull. So think about it, there's something very awkward about the movement in the second line here. Find even the ivory needle hard to pull. Like she has to yank it through the mesh as such then. It's not a fluent or fluid movement as such. It suggests a kind of a stuttering movement, and that might suggest a sense of nervousness or anxiety, and it does reinforce her sense of vulnerability, how frail or fragile or delicate perhaps she is. If we look at the first line again, Aunt Jennifer's fingers fluttering through her wool, if you think about it, there are two different meanings here, one positive, one negative. So her fingers fluttering through the wool, first of all, might suggest, of course, that at times then her fingers are very nimble and very agile, that she's very skilled, essentially. She's an expert in creating this beautiful tapestry. That obviously is something that she does, perhaps we'd say every week, maybe every day. If we think of fingers fluttering, we have that soft, faint F sound, the alliteration there again, that might suggest something smooth. But also when we think of fluttering, rather like a butterfly, you think, yes, it's beautiful, but it's also delicate, it's also weak, perhaps as well. So that would reinforce both aspects, both positive and negative then when it comes to that particular line. So we have the fingers fluttering then through the wool, find even the ivory needle hard to pull. And even ivory, of course, reminds us perhaps of endangered species things, perhaps we'd say the idea of a hunter then stalking an elephant and killing it just for its tusks, and then the idea of the tusks being harvested. I mean, obviously nowadays, of course, most countries have outlawed that, but back in the 1950s, of course, you still had that particular trade that was ongoing. So ivory, of course, would suggest perhaps the suffering of a creature, and the idea then the ivory would be harvested and obviously used then to make jewellery and so on. So it reinforces the idea perhaps of the ant's suffering as well. It might just simply suggest, of course, the idea that this is a creative outlet, but it takes her hours and hours, a kind of painstaking effort to create this particular panel, this particular screen. But it does suggest, perhaps we'd say, in her personal life, in her marriage as well, there's a lot of, we'd say, unspoken conflict or unspoken difficulties or suffering perhaps within that. The massive weight of Uncle's wedding band sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand. So if we think of the massive weight, of course, of a wedding band, first of all, a wedding band, of course, is supposed to represent the idea of intimacy, commitment, affection, love. But here it becomes almost like a ball and chain. It becomes like something, of course, that is used to confine, essentially, or restrict or limit the aunt. And that relates back then to Rich's attitude towards marriage, especially, of course, in the 1950s, or how marriage, of course, in a patriarchal society then oppressed women for so long. So notice how the wedding band is described as Uncle's wedding band. It's like a sign of his ownership, that he's the kind of proprietor, essentially, that he's the one in control, and that she, of course, then is subservient to him. So it's not even her own wedding band, it's the wedding ring that would be placed on her finger by him during the ceremony, and perhaps emphasizing the idea, of course, that she would wear the wedding band or wedding ring and that he would not. Okay, so the symbolism, of course, is very strong there, and it's just kind of reinforcing the idea of the ivory needle then as well. So we have an image perhaps which is normally associated with something positive becoming something quite sinister, quite ominous here as such. And once more the ant is depicted as quite fragile, it's kind of labouring under the weight of a wedding band. Notice how it's described simply as massive, enormous. So the heaviness of that then is reinforced in the last line of the second verse. Sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand. Okay, so it's almost like, of course, the idea then that the wedding ring represents her lack of freedom. Moving into the third and final verse then. When Aunt is dead, her terrified hands will lie, still ringed with ordeals she was mastered by. So even think of the use of the word mastered there, that particular verb. It does suggest the idea of a master and servant. Essentially, of course, that she was submissive and passive, and that her husband then, of course, was powerful and active. It also reinforces the essential contrast between the tigers who are free to roam, of course, and the tigers who will remain youthful and agile in the screen when Aunt Jennifer, of course, is long gone. So we see this particular image then of the ant as motionless, a cold, lifeless, inert body. When Aunt is dead, her terrified hands. Think about how, in the same way that Emily Dickinson did in After Great Pain, she uses the kind of personification of different parts of the body, or remember we call that cynic doshe, or san doshe as the Americans say, which emphasizes then the notion that one part of the body comes to represent the entirety or the whole of the body. So terrified hands, if you kind of think about it, of course, would relate back to the terror that she felt, of course, within the marriage itself. So the idea that she was powerless, the idea that she was voiceless, she had no real sense of identity, that she couldn't express herself in any meaningful way, that the only method or means of expression essentially would be to create these particular screens or panels then to weave the actual tapestry. So when she's dead, then her terrified hands will lie still ringed with ordeals. And ringed, of course, is now, or it has now become a verb, essentially, ringed with ordeals. It might suggest, of course, the idea then not just of the wedding band, but the engagement ring then as well, which is traditionally worn by women, but not by men. And think about an ordeal. An ordeal, of course, is a terrible experience that must be endured or suffered. So the ordeal might suggest the idea of cruelty or abuse within her marriage, which obviously remains, of course, unspoken, which remains then, of course, hidden, concealed, a secret. The tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing, proud and unafraid, once more reinforcing the central contrast that was established at the very beginning. Now, just going back to the word mastered there, I think that's a nice little pun actually, because I do think that it sort of emphasizes the notion perhaps of her husband as a kind of ring master, if you think about it. And then the tiger, of course, would be sort of like a circus animal. And then that would emphasize that Aunt Jennifer herself then, of course, is just a performer, and that her husband is in control, that he dominates and that he dictates to her. So the kind of dictatorial image that I mentioned at the very beginning is reinforced perhaps by the image of the ring master that is implied in the second line then of that last verse. So the tigers in the panel, of course, because they're fixed, they're frozen in time, they will never change, they'll never grow old, of course, they'll never lose their power. So the panel that she made will go on prancing. Notice how she repeats that word prancing there, kind of emphasizing once more this confident strut. So the idea they're sort of majestic creatures. And also the idea that they don't cow before anyone. Once more, they're masters of their own fate. So we'll go on prancing, proud and unafraid. So unafraid, of course, emphasizing how fearless they are. And remember, of course, the men were simply beneath the tree in the first verse. And then think about, of course, how Aunt Jennifer's fingers were fluttering and how she found the ivory needle hard to pull, the massive weight of the wedding ring, how it sat heavily upon her hand. So the contrast is emphasized yet again. Notice how she is using the plosive P sound in prancing, proud, and even panel in the second last line there too. Think about it, that reinforces, of course, a very energetic sense, but it also just reinforces, of course, the haughty or arrogant or imperious attitude of the tigers themselves too. Okay, so once more, make sure that you go back and have a look at the notes that I've given you. They're much more detailed just in terms of obviously the theme, but also the aspects of style. Boil down the aspects of style to something more manageable then, so you'll have kind of 2 or 3 aspects. I would suggest symbolism is a good one, the use of contrast, and maybe sound effects or structure. Kind of look at it that way, and then relate them back to the theme. Remember that a lot of you are still writing about style in isolation. You have to write about style to show how the style illustrates the themes and ideas explored in the poem. In other words, you must show the function of a particular aspect of style. So if she is using a regular rhyming scheme, why is she using a regular rhyming scheme? If she's using a very potent symbol such as the ivory needle, first of all, what does it mean? And then why does she use it? How do you relate it back to the theme of the poem? Okay, so it's very important that you're able to do that. It's very important that you have that in your head before you begin drafting a plan or writing an essay, or obviously, of course, revising then for the exam itself. Okay, so that's the first poem then by Adrian Rich. So that's Aunt Jennifer's Tigers. The next one will be Living in Sin. So I'm hoping to get that up at the beginning of next week. So if you read through that particular poem, and then I can go through it with you, you should have copious notes on that. Okay, and then I'll decide on the last 2, because I am going to whittle it down to 2. Trying to Talk to a Man, I think perhaps, and From a Survivor would be the last 2, but I may change. It just really depends really on how much time we have, because obviously everything's up in the air at the moment. So if you focus on Aunt Jennifer's Tigers and Living in Sin over the next week, Once more, have a look at the notes. Once more, go back and memorize the key points in relation to theme and style. Also, next week, I'll look at important quotations that you need to memorize as well. Okay, so we'll check out next week, like I said, focusing on living in sin. And then the following week, I'll probably take a break and then come back to you after Easter. Until then, guys, take care.